In the frozen winter of 1916, the most hated person in Russia was not the German Kaiser, but their own Empress, Alexandra Feodorovna. They called her Nemka, the German woman, a witch and a spy who was deliberately destroying the empire. They whispered that she was the debauched lover of the mad monk, Grigory Rasputin, passing around obscene cartoons that depicted her as a traitor, a whore, and the cause of all their suffering. To millions, she was a demon who had poisoned the Tsar and brought Russia to its knees. But the woman at the center of this firestorm was not a demon. She was, in fact, one of its most tragic victims. The German was, in her soul, a painfully shy Englishwoman. Queen Victoria's granddaughter, the whore, was a neurotic Puritan, pathologically in love with her husband. This is not a story of a woman who lusted for power. It is the far more tragic story of a love that was too big, a faith that was too blind, and a single terrible genetic secret, a curse she carried from England, that forced a desperate mother to save her only son, accidentally lighting the fire that burned an empire to the ground. The seeds of Empress Alexandra's tragedy were not sown in Russia. They were planted in the warm yet suffocating embrace of her grandmother, Queen Victoria. She was born in 1872 as Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt. On paper, she was a German princess from a minor, unimportant duchy known more for its artistic patronage than its military might. But in reality, Alex's soul and her upbringing were English. Her mother was Princess Alice, Queen Victoria's second daughter, and perhaps her most compassionate, intelligent child. Alice was a woman ahead of her time, a disciple of Florence Nightingale, concerned with sanitation, philosophy, and social welfare. She brought her English seriousness and sense of duty to the relaxed German court. The result was that Alex and her siblings were raised in a strange hybrid. It was German in its simplicity, bare floors, plain food, handmade clothes, but it was dominated by English language and culture. English was the language of the nursery. It was the language Alex spoke to her mother. And the frequent long trips to England were not visits, they were homecomings. She spent idyllic summers at Balmoral Castle in Scotland and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, running on the lawns, playing with her British cousins. She was Queen Victoria's most cherished, spoiled grandchild. Victoria called her Alecky. And in the family, she had another nickname, one that would in time become cruel. In its irony, they called her Sunny for her bright, sweet, cheerful disposition. She was a perfect, beloved product of the Victorian age, beautiful, virtuous, and raised for a safe, arranged future. And then when she was just 6 years old, that perfect, sunlit world shattered. Tragedy did not just strike. It came in two devastating waves, planting two fears in Alex's young mind that would define the rest of her life: a terror of illness and a terror of sudden loss. The first horror was a family secret, a genetic curse. Alex's mother, Princess Alice, was a carrier of hemophilia, the mysterious royal disease that her grandmother Victoria had passed to some of her descendants. In 1873, when Alex was only 1, her older brother, Frederick, Frit, fell from a second-story window. It should have been a simple broken bone, but the curse activated. He began to bleed internally, uncontrollably, and died in agony hours later. Alex was too young to understand, but she grew up in a house haunted by the death of a child. From an inexplicable sickness, a fragility in the blood. Then, 5 years later, in 1878, the second disaster struck, and this time, Alex was a direct witness. Diphtheria, the terrifying killer of Victorian nurseries, invaded the palace in Darmstadt. The disease swept through the family, striking all of Alex's siblings except for her sister, Ella. Their mother, Princess Alice, nursed her feverish, choking children herself, against doctors' advice, refusing to leave their bedsides. First, Alex's youngest sister, May, age 4, died. The family was plunged into grief. A few weeks later, Alex's brother Ernest, who was recovering, asked for May to comfort the grieving boy. Princess Alice leaned down and kissed him. It was a gesture of maternal love, and it was a death sentence. A few days later, Alice herself collapsed with the disease. On December 14th, the anniversary of her own father, Prince Albert's death, Princess Alice died at the age of 35. In 1 month, 6-year-old Alex had lost her sister and her mother. The event extinguished Sonny. The cheerful, outgoing child was gone. In her place was a new Alex, painfully shy, withdrawn, melancholic, and intensely, profoundly serious. She became wary of strangers. She developed a stiff, cold exterior, not from arrogance, but as a defense mechanism. She clung only to the very few people she trusted, absolutely, and she clung to something else, her faith. She threw herself into her strict Lutheran religion with an almost desperate intensity prayer. And church were not a habit, they were her lifeline. This childhood grief is the first psychological key to understanding her. Alex was not a frivolous person. Her childhood trauma shaped her absolutist personality, a pattern that would define every decision of her adult life. There were no half measures in Alex's character. After the tragedy, Queen Victoria stepped in, acting as a surrogate mother. She oversaw Alex's education, brought her to England even more frequently, and made it her personal mission to find her favorite, beautiful, but sad granddaughter a perfect match. Alex was now a young woman, stunningly beautiful, with long auburn hair and deep gray-blue eyes, but wrapped in a melancholy that people found both bewitching and unsettling. Victoria had a plan. She was the grand matchmaker of Europe, and she had the perfect candidate in mind, her grandson, the man who would one day be King of England, Prince Albert Victor, or Eddie. It was a perfect match on paper. It would bring Aleki back home to England, where she belonged. But Alex, though shy and dutiful, possessed an iron will when it came to matters of her heart. She had met Prince Eddie. She found him, to put it mildly, lacking. He was slow, listless, and rumored to be unstable. Alex, who craved a deep emotional connection, a union of souls, found him empty. She refused, politely but firmly. Queen Victoria, for once, was thwarted. She lamented in her journal that Alex was wrong and would regret it. But Alex didn't refuse out of pride. She refused because her heart, hopelessly and secretly, already belonged to someone else. Someone her grandmother Victoria did not approve. Of someone all of Europe deemed impossible. She was in love with the heir to a rival throne, a young man as shy and as melancholy as she was, Cesarevich Nicholas of Russia. Their fateful meeting happened in 1884, when Alex was just 12. She had traveled to St. Petersburg for the wedding of her sister, Ella, to Nicholas's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich. Her sister Ella was one of the few people Alex trusted implicitly. She was her confidant and her role model. And at that lavish, opulent festival, a world utterly alien to Alex, she met the 16-year-old heir to Russia. St. Petersburg was a shock. Her court in Darmstadt was quiet, almost bourgeois. The Russian court was a world of barbaric, Asiatic splendor. It was a world of thousand-room palaces, of glittering uniforms, of enormous gems worn as casual jewelry, and of long, smoky, sonorous Orthodox ceremonies. It was terrifying. And in the middle of all this frightening grandeur, she met Nicky. He was just like her, shy, gentle-natured, and completely overwhelmed by the world he was born into. His father, Tsar Alexander III, was a terrifying giant of a man, a true autocrat who bent iron bars with his bare hands and ruled his empire with an iron fist. Nicholas, by contrast, was sensitive, intelligent, and longed for a quiet life. He would have been a perfect English country squire, but he was the heir to an autocracy. When these two shy, melancholy teenagers met at a ball, it was an instant recognition. They were two similar souls in a world of loud, frightening adults. They danced, they whispered, and a deep, almost mystical bond was formed. As Nicholas later wrote in his diary, "It is my dream to one day marry Alex H." They met again 5 years later, in 1889, when a 17-year-old Alex came to visit her sister Ella in St. Petersburg. This time, it was no longer a childhood friendship. It was a profound love. They took long walks. They talked for hours about religion, philosophy, and their shared sense of isolation. Nicholas made up his mind. This was the only woman he would ever love, but everyone was against them. Nicholas's father, Alexander III, despised Germans. He scoffed at Alex as a little Hessian princess and forbade the match. Queen Victoria, though fond of Nicholas, loathed Russia. She called it a barbarous, unsafe country and did not want her precious Alecky to go there. She feared for her safety. But the biggest obstacle was not political. It was religious. To become Empress of Russia, Alex would have to renounce her Lutheran faith. She would have to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. For Alex, who had clung to her church as a lifeline since her mother's death, this was not just a technicality. It was a betrayal of her soul. Her faith was the core of who she was, her last link to her lost mother. She told Nicholas she loved him, but she could not do it. For the next 5 years, they remained apart, both miserable. Nicholas, though dutiful to his father, refused every other candidate. He became quietly stubborn. He would marry Alex, or he would marry no one. The stalemate was finally broken by another tragedy. In 1894, the health of the giant Tsar Alexander III began to fail. Rapidly, he had kidney disease. Faced with his own mortality and realizing his son would never budge, the old Tsar relented. He gave Nicholas his permission to propose. Nicholas, aged 26, immediately traveled to Coburg, Germany, where Alex was attending another royal wedding. He proposed, and Alex in agony refused him. She wept. She told him she loved him, but she could not change her religion. She could not give up her soul, not even for him. Nicholas was shattered. The couple spent the next few days in misery, avoiding each other at the parties. It seemed lost. But then a chorus of royal relatives intervened. Their cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who was present, pulled Alex aside. Wilhelm, a loud and blustering man, didn't use subtlety. He berated her, called her a fool, told her this was her destiny, that it was her duty, and that she was throwing away true love. More importantly, her beloved sister, Ella, now Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, spoke with her. Ella, who had also converted to Russian Orthodoxy, talked to Alex not of duty, but of beauty. She described the Orthodox faith not as a betrayal, but as a continuation, a deeper, more mystical form of Christianity. Finally, Nicholas returned, his eyes full of tears, and begged her one last time. And Alex, torn between love, family pressure, and religious fear, collapsed. She agreed. Nicholas wrote in his diary that night that it was a wonderful, unforgettable day. And this is the second psychological key to Alexandra. Alex never did anything by half. When she decided to accept her new faith, she did not just join the Russian Orthodox Church. She consumed it. She threw herself into her new faith with the absolute fanaticism of a convert. She learned Church Slavonic. She fell in love with the hours-long rituals, the mysticism, the icons, and the smell of incense. She found a drama and an emotionalism in orthodoxy that her cold intellectual Lutheran faith had never offered. It spoke directly to her melancholy absolutist soul. Within months, she had become more Russian than the Russians, at least in spirit. She took a new name, Alexandra Feodorovna. She had found a new faith. She was marrying the love of her life. She was ready to begin her new life as the future empress. But her new life began not with a celebration, but with a funeral. Just months after their engagement, in the autumn of 1894, Tsar Alexander III died suddenly in the Crimea. Nicholas, aged 26, utterly unprepared, became Tsar of all the Russias. Alexandra traveled to Russia, not as a radiant bride, but as a mourner, walking behind the coffin of her future father-in-law. Their wedding, in November 1894, was held just 1 week after the Tsar's funeral. It took place in a somber, mournful atmosphere. Alexandra wore her wedding finery, but the entire court was in deep black. She later wrote, "Our wedding seemed a continuation of the funeral. A dead priest stood between us." It was a terrible omen. Alexandra Sonny was gone, and Alexandra the German had arrived in Russia, bringing death with her. The next omen was even bloodier, and it sealed the public's perception of her forever. Their coronation was planned for May 1896 in Moscow. It was to be an event of unimaginable splendor, designed to impress the world with Russia's power and wealth. As part of the celebration, a massive public feast was planned for the people on Kodinka Field, outside Moscow. Hundreds of thousands gathered to receive free commemorative gifts, an enameled mug, some sausage and bread. But the organization was a disaster. There were not enough distribution booths. A rumor swept the massive crowd that there were not enough gifts, that officials were hoarding them. The crowd began to surge. A panic broke out. Within an hour, over 1,300 people, men, women, and children, were crushed and trampled to death. Thousands more were injured. It was one of the worst peacetime disasters in Russian history. The field was turned into an open-air morgue. When the news reached Nicholas and Alexandra in the Kremlin, they were horrified. Nicholas was devastated and wanted to cancel the rest of the celebrations, especially the opulent ball being given that night by the French ambassador. But his influential uncles, the old rigid Grand Dukes who truly ran the empire, forbade it. They told him that canceling the ball would be a diplomatic insult to France, Russia's new vital ally. They told him a czar could not show weakness. And so Nicholas, ever the hater of confrontation, relented. That night, just hours after the disaster, Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, in their magnificent coronation robes, arrived at the French ambassador's ball. They entered a glittering ballroom while the bodies of their crushed subjects were still being collected from the field. For the Russian people, this was an unforgivable act of callousness. It was proof. Nicholas was not their little father, he was Nicholas the Bloody. And Alexandra, she was the foreigner, the German, who had brought the curse. She was the woman on blood. Her public perception from day one was stained by tragedy. She entered her royal life as a woman already despised, and that changed her. The St. Petersburg court should have been her home, but it became her private hell. The Russian aristocracy was one of the most sophisticated in the world. They spoke French better than Russian. They lived for glittering balls, Parisian couture, casual love affairs, and malicious gossip. They were frivolous, charming, and cruel. And then Alexandra arrived. She was a Victorian English woman. She was serious. She was painfully shy. She blushed at an off-color joke. She found their ladies decadent and frivolous. She believed in the sanctity of marriage and duty. She could not make small talk, the social flirtations. Worse, she suffered from chronic sciatica, a nerve pain in her legs which made it painful to stand or walk. This meant that at balls, she often sat alone, looking stiff, with a pained expression on her face. The aristocracy misread this completely. They didn't see a shy, pained, and morally serious woman. They saw an arrogant, cold, stuck-up German who clearly hated them. And so they hated her back. They mocked her heavy Russian accent. They mocked her unfashionable dresses. They called her the German, even though she was English. They called her the stiff Hessian. Alexandra, already shy and scarred from her childhood, did what she always did when threatened. She withdrew. She despised the loud public winter palace in St. Petersburg. She convinced Nicholas to move the family to the Alexander Palace, a private, secluded estate in Tsarskoe Selo, 15 miles outside the city. She built a psychological cocoon. She turned her back on the court, on society, and on Russia. Her world shrank to one person, her husband, Nicky, whom she adored, and to one mission. A mission that would become her all-consuming, destructive obsession to bear a male heir. This task was paramount. Russian law forbade women from inheriting the throne. Russia needed a Tsarevich to secure the dynasty's future. In 1895, Alexandra gave birth to Olga, a lovely daughter. The court sighed. In 1897, she gave birth to Tatiana, a beautiful daughter. The court began to whisper. In 1899, she gave birth to Maria, another daughter. The disappointment became tangible. In 1901, she gave birth to Anastasia, a fourth daughter. Now it was a dynastic crisis. 4 beautiful, healthy girls, Atma, but no heir. Alexandra, who had given up everything for Russia, who had betrayed her own faith, felt like a failure. Her desperation became a heavy physical presence. She was publicly humiliated. She had failed in her only duty. Her shyness turned to hysteria. Her faith, once a comfort, now became a frantic mystical quest for a miracle. She plunged into Russian mysticism. She sought out starets, prophets, and wanderers. She brought a French mystic named Monsieur Philippe into the court, who claimed he could grant her a son through the power of prayer. He gained such incredible influence over her that he even convinced her she was pregnant with a son, a phantom pregnancy that lasted 9 months, ending in abject humiliation when no baby was born. She was the laughingstock of Europe, but she didn't care. She just wanted a son. And then in August 1904, in the midst of Russia's disastrous war with Japan, a miracle. Alexandra finally gave birth to a son, Alexei. The empire celebrated. Cannons fired. Churches rang their bells. Alexandra was the happiest woman in the world. She had fulfilled her duty. She was saved. That joy lasted for 6 weeks. 6 weeks later, the infant began to bleed uncontrollably from his navel. The imperial doctors, the best in Europe, were summoned. They worked in a panic, trying to staunch the flow. And then, in the horrified silence of the imperial bedchamber, the diagnosis was delivered. Alexei had hemophilia. It was the royal disease. And where had it come from? It was the curse of Victoria's line passed down from the Queen of England through her daughter Alice to Alice's daughter, Alexandra. You must understand what this meant. This was not just a medical tragedy. For Alexandra, it was a divine punishment. It was her fault. She was the one who had brought this curse into the pure Romanov line. She had poisoned the heir to the empire. Her guilt was immeasurable. It broke her completely. All logic, all reason evaporated, replaced by a single, all-consuming goal: keep this child alive. Life in the cocoon now became a gilded asylum. Alexei became the center of the universe. Thick carpets were laid. Table corners were padded. He was not allowed to run. Every fall, every bruise was a potentially lethal crisis. The boy lived in constant pain, his joints swelling agonizingly, and the doctors, the men of science, could do nothing. They could only shake their heads and tell her to pray. So Alexandra prayed. She prayed with a hysterical, desperate intensity. Science had failed. Logic had failed. She needed a miracle. And in 1905, a miracle arrived in the form of a coarse, filthy Siberian peasant with hypnotic eyes and a bizarre reputation. His name was Grigory Rasputin. He was a muzhik, a peasant from the vast frozen expanse of Siberia. He was a starets, a wandering holy man, a spiritual pilgrim who had walked thousands of miles, visiting monasteries and holy sites. He was also a notorious drunkard, a brawler, and, by all accounts, a man of overwhelming animalistic charisma. He was filthy, his beard matted, his fingernails black, and he smelled of the earth. He was in every conceivable way the absolute antithesis of the perfumed, French-speaking aristocratic world of St. Petersburg. And it was this very otherness that gave him his power. The Russian aristocracy in the years before the war was in a state of deep spiritual decay. They were bored, decadent, and obsessed with the occult. They dabbled in seances, table tapping, and mysticism as a parlor game. When Rasputin arrived in the capital, sponsored by high society ladies like the Montenegrin princesses, he was a sensation. He wasn't a pale, intellectual cleric. He was the real, holy Russia. He was raw, he was dangerous, and he had hypnotic, burning eyes that seemed to look straight into your soul. He was, to these bored aristocrats, a new and thrilling spiritual toy. It was through this society network that he was finally fatefully introduced to the Empress. Alexandra, at first, was just one of many who was intrigued. He was a man of God, and she was desperate for any spiritual comfort. But he remained on the fringes, a curious figure, until the day the cocoon was breached by its greatest terror. One of Alexei's worst bleeding episodes had occurred. The boy had fallen, and an internal hemorrhage had caused his leg to swell to the size of a melon. He was in screaming, white-hot agony. The imperial doctors, the finest men of science in Europe, had exhausted every treatment. They stood by, helpless, and finally gently told the Empress to prepare for the end. The boy was dying. This was Alexandra's ultimate nightmare. Her son, her heir, the meaning of her entire existence, was being tortured to death in the room next to her. And it was her fault. Her guilt, her fanaticism, and her desperation reached a breaking point. She would try anything, any charm, any prayer, any holy man. In this final desperate hour, she sent for the Siberian peasant the imperial bedchamber in the Alexander Palace, a masterpiece of gilded Art Nouveau elegance. The child, pale and skeletal, lying on his bed, his screams reduced to weak moans, the greatest doctors in Russia, in their starched collars, standing by uselessly. And into this sterile, terrified room walks Grigory Rasputin. He is filthy from the road, his peasant boots tracking mud onto the priceless carpets. He ignores the doctors. He ignores the Empress. He walks to the child's bed, looks down at the writhing boy, and does nothing. He did not bring medicine. He did not perform an examination. He simply stood, his presence filling the room, and prayed. He spoke to the boy in a low, calm Siberian monotone. He touched his forehead, and then he turned to the hysterical Empress and said, with absolute hypnotic certainty, "Do not worry. The little one will not die. The doctors must not bother him." And then he left. Alexandra, clinging to this one thread of hope, followed his command. She sat by the bed, and for the first time in days, the palace was quiet. Alexei's screams stopped. He fell into a deep, natural sleep. The next morning, the fever had broken. The swelling in his leg had begun to subside within a week. He was recovering. It was to Alexandra a miracle, a direct intervention from God himself. The men of science had failed. The man of God had succeeded. From that moment on, Rasputin was no longer just a holy man. He was the holy man. He was her savior. But what actually happened? How did a Siberian peasant succeed where the best doctors in Europe failed? This is the central, non-mystical crux of the entire Romanov tragedy. Historians have two very logical, very human explanations. The first is psychological Alexandra. In her panic was a whirlwind of hysteria. Her anxiety was toxic, raising the child's blood pressure, making it impossible for a clot to form. Rasputin, with his absolute Zen-like calm, broke the feedback loop. He calmed the mother. The mother's calm, in turn, calmed the child. His heart rate slowed, his blood pressure dropped, and the body's natural healing mechanisms were finally able to form a clot. The second theory is even more chilling, and more likely, what were the doctors giving the child for his agonizing pain? In 1905, the miracle drug, the cure-all for pain and fever, was a brand new invention, aspirin. What the doctors did not know, what no one knew, was that aspirin is a powerful anticoagulant. It is a lethal blood thinner. In their desperate attempt to cure the boy's pain, they were, in fact, scientifically preventing his blood from clotting. They were killing him. Rasputin, with his peasant suspicion of all doctors' potions, simply ordered them to stop. Do not bother him with your medicines. By stopping the cure, he stopped the poison, and the boy's body healed itself. But for Alexandra, the how did not matter. Only the that. Science had failed. Rasputin had succeeded. Her mind, already absolutist and desperate, now locked into a new, unshakable, and fatal logic. In this new reality, Alexei's life was the only thing that mattered in the universe. And if Rasputin was the only man on earth who could save that life, then he could no longer be just a man. He had to be a saint. He was a prophet, the personal voice of God, sent directly to her in her darkest hour. This equation created a terrifying and simple conclusion. Since Rasputin equaled Alexei's life, any attack on Rasputin was not just politics. It was a mortal sin. It was an attack on God. It was, in Alexandra's terrified mind, a direct and literal attempt to murder her son. This psychological fortress, built from a mother's bottomless love, her crushing guilt, and her primal terror, was impenetrable. It would, in time, prove to be the tomb of the dynasty. Life inside the cocoon at the Alexander Palace now revolved around this new, bizarre axis. The family's isolation became even more profound. Alexandra had her husband, her 5 children, and our friend, as he was now called. She needed no one else. The routine of the children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, was one of almost bizarre contrast. They were the children of the wealthiest man in the world, yet they lived like pupils in a strict, upper-class English boarding school. This was Alexandra's doing. She despised the decadent Russian aristocracy and was terrified of her children being spoiled. They slept on simple, hard camp cots, just as she had as a girl. They took cold baths in the morning. Their food was simple. Their lessons were rigorous. They were taught to be frugal, to mend their own clothes, and to be unfailingly polite to the servants. It was, in a vacuum, a noble and modest upbringing, but it was not a vacuum. It was a prison. The 4 Atma sisters had no friends their own age. They were never allowed to attend a debutante ball, a house party, or even a simple tea with other aristocratic children. They were a hermetically sealed unit. their entire emotional world consisting of each other. They were loving, they were close, but they were profoundly, damagingly isolated. Into this innocent, isolated, all-female world of the nursery, Alexandra now invited Grigory Rasputin, and this is where the public disgust turned to active, visceral horror. Alexandra, in her deluded piety, saw no danger. She saw Rasputin not as a man, but as a holy vessel, a being almost beyond gender, like Christ among his disciples. She encouraged him to visit the girls in their nursery, to pray with them, even when they were in their simple nightgowns. Preparing for bed to her, this was a sign of his pure, paternal spiritual love. To the outside world, it was an unspeakable violation. The girls' governesses were horrified. One, Sofia Tucheva, was so appalled by the access this crude, smelly peasant had to the imperial daughters that she went to the Tsar and formally protested. She was dismissed immediately. Alexandra fired her. The message was sent loud and clear. Loyalty to Rasputin trumped all decency, all protocol, all reason. Of course, the whispers began. The court, already hating Alexandra, now had the ultimate weapon. The German was not just cold, she was degenerate. The rumors, which Alexandra was completely oblivious to, became darker and more fantastic. They said Rasputin was not just her advisor, but her lover, that he was sleeping with all 4 of the grand duchesses, that the palace at night was a scene of debauched, mystical orgies. The secret police, the Ukraina, who were tapping Rasputin's phone and following his other life, did nothing to stop these rumors. In fact, their reports only fueled them. They documented his nightly escapades in St. Petersburg, the drunken brawls, the visits to bathhouses, the prostitutes, the society ladies. He took to his private apartment where he preached his bizarre doctrine that one could only find true grace after committing great sin. This was the core of the tragedy. Alexandra, the Victorian prude, the neurotic Puritan, who blushed at an off-color joke, was now seen by the entire world as the center of a debauched sex cult. The pornographic cartoons that flooded the city, showing Rasputin with the Empress and her daughters, were not just slander. In the public mind, they were the truth. The political world was just as horrified. The Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, a brilliant and tough reformer, saw Rasputin as a mortal threat to the stability of the state. In 1911, he confronted the Tsar directly. He presented Nicholas with a dossier compiled by the secret police detailing Rasputin's sexual depravity and financial corruption. He gave the Tsar an ultimatum: Rasputin or me. Nicholas, who hated confrontation and was now completely under his wife's spiritual control, was trapped. He did what he always did. He capitulated to his wife. Stolypin was dismissed from the Tsar's presence. A few weeks later, Stolypin was assassinated at the Kiev Opera House in full view of the Tsar and his daughters. The last best hope for a sane and stable Russia was gone. Now even the family turned on her. Alexandra's own sister, the one person she loved and trusted most in the world, Ella, made a final desperate appeal. Ella, herself a devout Orthodox convert who had become a nun after her own husband's assassination, was beyond reproach. She traveled to Tsarskoye Selo to plead with her Alecky. She begged her, sister to sister, to see the damage Rasputin was doing. "You are endangering the dynasty," she warned. "You are pushing Russia to the abyss." Alexandra's reaction was terrifying in its coldness. She saw her beloved sister not as a concerned relative, but as another attacker, another Judas who was trying to kill her son. She turned on Ella with a cold fury, accusing her of not having enough faith, of listening to wicked society gossip. She ordered her sister out of the palace. The bond, forged in their shared childhood grief, was broken forever. Alexandra had made her final choice. She had chosen Rasputin over her own sister. She had chosen Rasputin over the prime minister. She had chosen Rasputin over the entire Russian aristocracy. Her cocoon was now complete. It was just her, her family, and their friend against the entire world. For a few years, this toxic, unstable equilibrium held the family lived in their isolated bubble. The children grew. Alexei survived his bleeding episodes, and the court festered with hatred. Then in 1914, the final external shock came that shattered the bubble forever war. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. This was not just a political catastrophe. For Alexandra, it was a personal one. Her husband's empire was now at war with her brother's empire. But more importantly, she, the Empress of Russia, was a German princess. The public, which already despised her, now had a single unifying and lethal focal point for their hatred. She was not just the stiff Hessian who was manipulated by a madman. She was, quite simply, the enemy, the Nemka, the German spy in the palace. In reality, Alexandra was a ferocious Russian patriot. She despised her cousin Kaiser Wilhelm II, whom she saw as a bombastic, godless warmonger. She threw herself into the war effort with the same all-or-nothing fanaticism she applied to her faith. This, she believed, was her chance to finally win over the Russian people, to prove her loyalty. She, along with her two eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, enrolled in the Red Cross. They would become Sisters of Mercy. This should have been her greatest public relations victory. The image of the Empress and the Grand Duchesses in the simple white smocked uniforms of nurses, tending to the brave, wounded soldiers, was powerful. And Tatiana, it turned out, was a natural. She was calm, efficient, and had a high tolerance for gore. She was a brilliant surgical nurse, beloved by the doctors and the soldiers alike for her steady, reassuring presence. But Alexandra was not. She was, in truth, a terrible nurse. She was not built for the grim physical reality of a surgical ward. The sight of so much blood, the smell of ether and gangrene, made her faint. She was too sensitive, too neurotic. So instead of assisting in the surgery, she found a different role. She would float through the wards like a gray ghost holding icons, sitting by the beds of the dying and praying for their souls. She turned her hospital work into a religious, mystical mission. The doctors and other nurses, busy trying to save lives, found her unsettling, otherworldly, and frankly, in the way her one great attempt to connect with her people had failed, reinforcing her image as a cold, strange fanatic. And then in the autumn of 1915, with the war going disastrously, she made her final, fatal move. The Russian army was in a full, disorganized retreat. The generals were incompetent. The people were losing faith. Alexandra, in her cocoon, knew who was to blame, everyone but her husband, and she knew who had the solution. Our friend, Rasputin, who was now having visions, told her that Russia was failing because the Tsar, the Little Father, the anointed of God, was not at the head of his armies. He told her that victory would only come if Nicholas took personal sacred command. This idea electrified Alexandra. It was the perfect fusion of her two beliefs, her faith in mysticism and her worship of her husband. She began a relentless daily campaign of letters and private conversations, urging, begging, and bullying her weak-willed husband to be the master, to be Ivan the Terrible to crush them all. In August 1915, Nicholas, the man who hated confrontation and adored his wife, finally relented. He made the single most catastrophic decision of his entire reign. He dismissed his capable uncle, Grand Duke Nicholas, as commander-in-chief, and he, a man with no military experience, A man whose only military skill was an obsession with new uniforms, went to the front to take personal divine command of the Russian army. This was the end. It was a military disaster, as he knew nothing of strategy. But it was a political apocalypse. By leaving the capital, he had, in effect, abdicated his throne. He was hundreds of miles away, moving pins on a map and playing chess. And who did he leave in charge of the entire Russian Empire in the middle of a catastrophic war with Germany? He left his wife, Alexandra. The darkest nightmare of the Russian people had just come true. The Nemka, the German woman whom everyone believed was a spy and who was the known puppet of a debauched Siberian peasant, was now the absolute ruler of Russia. The period from the autumn of 1915 to the winter of 1916 was not a government. It was a national train wreck, a slow-motion implosion of the entire Russian state, orchestrated from the Empress's mauve boudoir in the Alexander Palace Alexandra, now wielding the full autocratic power of her absent husband, was no longer just a recluse. She was the acting ruler of an empire at war, and she was utterly dangerously unqualified for the task. Her only advisor, her only confidant, her only source of policy was Grigory Rasputin. The relationship that had once been a private, mystical family secret was now the central catastrophic engine of Russian politics. The system of government descended into a grotesque, dark farce. Alexandra, guided by her friend, began to appoint and dismiss the highest ministers of the empire based on their loyalty not to Russia or even to the Tsar, but to Rasputin himself. The government became a revolving door of incompetence, known famously as ministerial leapfrog. In the span of just 16 months, Russia churned through 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, 3 foreign ministers, and 3 ministers of war competent. Experienced statesmen like Alexander Krivoshein, who had warned the Tsar against this madness, were dismissed. They were replaced by a parade of corrupt sycophants, bizarre mystics, and outright incompetents, whose only qualification was that they had paid their respects to the Siberian peasant and kissed his hand. We must be clear about what was happening. Alexandra was not a German spy. She was, in her own mind, a super patriot, fighting a holy war against the godless Germans abroad and the decadent liberals at home. She wrote to Nicholas at headquarters almost daily, long, rambling, hysterical letters filled with a toxic mixture of wifely adoration, spiritual fanaticism, and disastrous political advice. Be the master, she would urge him. Be Peter the Great, be Ivan the Terrible, crush them all. They need to feel the whip. She would pass on Rasputin's visions as divine commands. Our friend says to appoint X to this post. She would write, our friend had a dream that we must advance on this front. She was, in effect, channeling the whims of a semi-literate mystic and presenting them as infallible, holy writ. The result was the total disintegration of the state. The army, fighting a brutal war on the Eastern Front, was dying in the trenches from a lack of supplies. They had no rifles, no ammunition, no boots, no bread. Why? Because the very ministries in charge of supplying them were being run by men Rasputin had appointed, men who were either hopelessly inept or criminally corrupt. The transport system collapsed. Food rotted on railway sidings while the cities of Petrograd and Moscow began to starve. The war effort, which had been difficult, now became impossible. The soldiers at the front knew exactly who to blame. They knew the stories. They were dying by the millions, they believed, because a German witch and a mad monk were deliberately betraying them. The rest of the Romanov family, the dozens of grand dukes and duchesses, watched this unfold with absolute, paralyzing horror. This was no longer about a private, embarrassing family matter. Alexandra and her peasant were not just shaming the dynasty, they were systematically dismantling the 300-year-old empire to save their own skins. They saw the abyss of revolution opening up directly beneath their feet, and they knew who had pushed them to the edge. The family, which had once been fractured by petty jealousies, now united in a single desperate goal. Rasputin had to go, and Alexandra, the source of his power, had to be neutralized. They tried one last time to appeal to reason. The Tsar's own mother, the formidable Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, traveled to the Stavka to confront her son. She pleaded, she wept, she demanded he send Alexandra away and banish Rasputin. Nicholas listened, as he always did, with his placid, kind, and infuriatingly calm blue eyes. He kissed his mother's hand, and he did nothing. The Tsar's own sister Zenia wrote him frantic letters. His cousins, the Grand Dukes, staged a formal intervention begging him to grant a constitution. To listen to the people, Nicholas dismissed them all as panicked and disloyal. He had become a political automaton, completely controlled by his wife's hysterical long-distance commands. By December 1916, the aristocracy realized that persuasion was futile. The Tsar was a lost cause. The state was dying. If they were to save the monarchy, if they were to save Russia, they would have to take matters into their own hands. They would have to cut out the cancer themselves. They would have to exorcise the demon. They would have to kill Rasputin. The plot was not a simple assassination. It was a Gothic, aristocratic conspiracy, born of equal parts patriotism and decadent rage. The ringleader was Prince Felix Yusupov, the heir to the largest fortune in Russia, a man of flamboyant, androgynous beauty, who was married to the Tsar's own niece, Irina. He was joined by a man who was, in many ways, the golden boy of the Romanovs, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich. Dmitry was the Tsar's cousin, a dashing cavalry officer, and, ironically, a man whom many, including perhaps Alexandra herself, had once hoped would marry the eldest Grand Duchess, Olga. This was not a murder by outsiders. It was a desperate, bloody act of internal cleansing. The plan itself was pure, lurid theater. On the night of December 29, 1916, Felix, using his beautiful wife Irina as bait, lured Rasputin to the Yusupov family's magnificent Moika Palace in Petrograd. He brought the peasant down to a lavishly decorated soundproofed cellar room designed for secret parties. There, Felix, the perfect, charming host, fed the holy man delicate cakes and glasses of sweet Madeira wine. The food and wine were laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill a dozen men. They sat and talked. Felix played his guitar, and they waited. And Grigory Rasputin, with his superhuman peasant's constitution, simply did not die. He complained the wine was a bit sweet and asked for more. Felix, in a state of sheer aristocratic panic, ran upstairs, grabbed Dmitry's revolver, came back down, and shot Rasputin in the chest. The demon fell with a roar. The conspirators, relieved, gathered their coats, preparing to dispose of the body. But as Felix went to check the corpse, Rasputin's eyes snapped open. He was alive. With a blood-curdling scream, he lunged at Felix, tearing one of his epaulets off, and then clawed his way up the stairs and out into the snowy courtyard, roaring that he would tell the Tsarina everything. The other conspirators waiting outside were frozen in horror. It was as if a literal devil had survived their attack. They chased him, firing their guns wildly in the dark. Rasputin was shot again, in the back and in the head. He finally fell into a snowbank. Still not trusting that he was dead, they clubbed the body with a truncheon, wrapped it in a heavy curtain, drove it to the Malaya Nevka River, and pushed it through a hole in the ice. The news of the murder swept through Petrograd like a wildfire, and the reaction was not one of horror, but of celebration. The city rejoiced. People cheered in the streets. Strangers embraced. At the theater, the audience stood and sang the national anthem when the news was announced. The spell was broken. The dark force was gone. Russia, they believed, was saved. But inside the Alexander Palace, the reaction was the precise, terrifying opposite. Nicholas, at headquarters, was crushed. This was not a political act. It was a betrayal. It was a common, sordid murder, committed by his own blood, his cousin, the man who had been like a son to him. He was disgusted and heartbroken. But it was Alexandra's reaction that was the most profound. She did not just grieve, she shattered. This, to her, was the ultimate apocalyptic proof that the world was evil. The aristocracy, the decadent society she had always despised, had now murdered a man of God, the protector of her son. The one talisman that stood between Alexei and death was gone. She was now alone, surrounded by murderers. Her paranoia and her fanaticism calcified. She became a living monument of grief and vengeance. She had Rasputin's body retrieved from the river. She held a private, hysterical funeral, which she forced her shocked, horrified children to attend. She had the holy martyr buried on the palace grounds, and she began plans to build a massive church over his grave, a shrine she would visit daily. She became obsessed with his letters, his photograph, and the simple wooden icon he had given her. The murder of Rasputin, the act that was supposed to save the monarchy, did the precise opposite. It accelerated its doom. It did not bring Alexandra to her senses. It drove her over the final edge into a morbid religious obsession. It removed the one person who, however disastrously, had been making decisions, and left a vindictive, isolated and half-mad empress in his place. And it sent a clear message to the Russian people. The autocracy was so diseased, so rotten to its core, that its own grand dukes were resorting to assassination and poisoning in palace cellars. The entire system was finished. Alexandra, now wrapped entirely in her grief, was ready for her own martyrdom. She was completely blind to the reality of the nation she supposedly ruled, and just 8 weeks later that reality came, not as a polite knock, but as a revolutionary firestorm. The final collapse, when it came in February 1917, was not a planned Bolshevik-led coup. It was not a grand political maneuver. It was a spontaneous, primal scream of hunger and cold. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was one of the most brutal in Russian history. Petrograd was buried in snow, and the railway system, already crippled by Alexandra's ministerial leapfrog, ground to a complete halt. The city, which depended on the railways for its lifeblood, began to die. There was no firewood, there was no coal, and most importantly, there was no flour. The factories, unable to get fuel, shut down, putting tens of thousands of desperate, angry men out of work. And the women, the mothers of the city, were forced to stand in bread lines in 20-degree below zero weather for 8, 10, 12 hours, only to be told when they reached the front that the bakery was empty. On February 23rd, International Women's Day, their patience snapped. They left the lines, smashed the windows of the bakeries, and began to riot. They marched on the factories, their ranks swelling with tens of thousands of laid-off workers, shouting, not for revolution, but for bread. And where was Alexandra during this? She was trapped in the ultimate tragic irony. She was at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, completely oblivious, her entire world consumed by a different kind of fever, in a final cruel twist of fate, just as the empire was about to be consumed by a political firestorm. All 5 of her children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, had fallen violently ill with the measles. One by one, they had succumbed, their fevers raging, their bodies racked with the illness, which was soon complicated by pneumonia. The cocoon had become a dark, silent infirmary. Alexandra, the woman who had failed as an empress, was now fully engaged in the one role she truly mastered, that of a nurse. Her days and nights were spent in the darkened sick rooms, bathing her children's foreheads, forcing down medicine, and praying. She was completely, totally cut off from the reality just 15 miles down the road. She heard the distant rumbles of unrest, but she dismissed them, as she always did, as hooligan movements. She was still sending frantic, delusional telegrams to Nicholas at the Stavka, urging him to be the master and crush the rabble. She was the last person in Russia to understand that the game was over. The Tsar, receiving these telegrams, also dismissed the crisis. He sent his final fatal order to the military governor of Petrograd. I command you to put a stop to these disorders in the capital by tomorrow. This is not to be delayed. The troops were called out, but these were not the hardened, loyal soldiers of 1905. That army was dead, rotting in the trenches of Poland. These were new recruits, sullen peasants and factory workers in their 30s and 40s, just as cold and just as hungry as the women in the streets. On February 26th, a company of the Pavlovsky Lifeguards was ordered to fire into a crowd. They did, and then, horrified by what they had done, they returned to their barracks, and they mutinied. They shot their own officers. That was the sound of the autocracy dying. It was the snap. The next day, regiment after regiment came over. They poured out of their barracks, guns in hand, and joined the people. The city fell into their hands. Police stations were burned. The arsenals were looted. Prisons were opened. It was total chaotic and leaderless anarchy. Nicholas, finally realizing the scale of the disaster, tried to race back to his family, but it was too late. His authority had evaporated. Revolutionary railway workers diverted his train, shunting the Tsar of all the Russias onto a remote siding like forgotten cargo. There, in his imperial train car, his generals came to him one by one and told him the truth. The army would not support him. It was over. To save Russia, he had to abdicate. On March 2nd, 1917, Nicholas, the man who had never wanted to rule, gave up his throne. He abdicated not only for himself but also for his sick son, Alexei. He knew the boy could never survive the storm. Back at the Alexander Palace, the news was finally delivered to Alexandra. She reacted with predictable, spitting fury. "It is a lie," she screamed at the messenger. "A lie! They cannot have done this. Nicky is the autocrat. He cannot abdicate." She was in a state of total hysterical denial, but as the days passed and the reality set in, her fury was replaced by a new, cold, and almost serene state. She was no longer an empress. She was simply citizen Alexandra Romanova, and she was a prisoner. Nicholas was allowed to return to the palace, to join his family in their imprisonment. Their reunion was tearful, but also surreal. They were all together in the cocoon at last, but the cocoon was now their jail. The first great humiliation for Alexandra was the guards, the loyal, adoring Cossack convoy who had treated them as demigods, were gone. They were replaced by revolutionary soldiers, young, brash peasants who now held all the power. You must imagine this for Alexandra. She, the empress, who could not bear to be looked at, who demanded absolute deference, was now at their mercy. These new guards would walk the magnificent halls of her home with their hats on, their coats unbuttoned. They would lounge on the delicate silk-upholstered furniture, smoking crude cigarettes, the smoke staining the painted ceilings. They would scrawl obscene graffiti on the walls, often targeting the Nemka. They blocked her path in the corridors, staring at her with insolent curiosity, refusing to make way. They delighted in their newfound power. Alexandra, however, did not break. She did not plead. She did not weep, at least not in public. She retreated into the one defense she had left, her impenetrable, icy, aristocratic contempt. She refused to acknowledge the guards' existence. She would look through them as if they were not there. She saw them not as her jailers, but as rabble, a temporary annoyance before God, inevitably restored her husband to his rightful place. She was still in her own mind the Empress. This cold, infuriating arrogance, which had alienated the aristocracy, now served as her only armor against her captors. She focused her entire, obsessive energy on her family. She nursed her children back to health. She prayed for hours. She read the Bible, and she wrote in her diaries, and she waited for rescue. That rescue, she believed, would come from her family in England. Her cousin, King George V. The new provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was eager to get the Romanovs out of Russia. The family was a living banner for royalists, a dangerous magnet for counter-revolution. More importantly, Kerensky was terrified the Petrograd Soviet, the radical Bolshevik-led council, would storm the palace and lynch the family. He desperately needed them gone. He negotiated with the British government, and for a few weeks it seemed certain a plan was made. A British cruiser would sail to a northern port. The family would be smuggled out. They packed their bags, and then the telegram came. King George V, their cousin Georgie, had withdrawn the offer. The king, it turned out, was terrified. His own throne in Britain was shaky. Anti-German sentiment was at its peak, and his own family name was the German Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. His advisors warned him that bringing the bloody Tsar, and most of all, the universally despised German Tsarina, to England could ignite a revolution on their own soil. In a cold, pragmatic act of political and personal betrayal, King George V washed his hands of his family. The door slammed shut. For Alexandra, this was the ultimate betrayal. She was not just a prisoner of the revolution. She was an outcast. From her own blood, there was no escape. By the summer of 1917, the situation in Petrograd had become even more chaotic. The provisional government was failing Lenin. The Bolshevik leader was back in Russia demanding all power to the Soviets. The family at Tsarskoye Selo was in mortal danger. Kerensky, in a final desperate move, decided he had to move them, not to safety in England, but to obscurity. He would hide them in the one place so vast, so remote, that no one would think to look: Siberia. In the dead of night on August 1st, 1917, Alexandra, Nicholas, and their 5 children were loaded onto a train, marked with a new, terrifying anonymity. It bore no imperial eagles. It simply read, "Mission of the Japanese Red Cross." As the train pulled away from the station, Alexandra looked out the window at the palace that had been her fortress for over 20 years. She was leaving her home forever. Their destination was Tobolsk, a remote, sleepy, swampy town in the heart of western Siberia. Upon arrival, they were marched to their new prison, the former governor's mansion. It was a large, comfortable house, but it was unequivocally a prison. A high wooden stockade was immediately built around the perimeter, enclosing the house in a small garden. The cocoon had shrunk again to the size of a single city block. And here, in Tobolsk, the last normal phase of their lives began. It was a life of surreal, suffocating monotony. They were in limbo. The guards, at first, were the same soldiers from Tsarskoye Selo, and while disrespectful, they were not yet murderous. A strange, listless routine set in. Nicholas, to keep his sanity, became obsessed with physical labor, sawing and chopping firewood for hours a day. And Alexandra? This is where her final transformation took place. Stripped of her power, stripped of her purpose, she retreated entirely into her two remaining obsessions, her family and her faith. She seemingly found a strange, morbid peace in their fall. She no longer had to pretend to be an empress. She no longer had to face the court she despised. She could just be a mother and a wife, cut off from the world she hated. She spent her days in a wheelchair or on a chaise lounge, claiming her sciatica and a heart condition made her an invalid. She was surrounded by her icons, her Bibles, and her prayer books. She was preparing herself and her family for martyrdom. She truly believed that this was their Calvary, that they were a sacrifice like Christ for the sins of the Russian people. She was serene, she was calm, and she was utterly detached from the reality that they were, in fact, prisoners of a brutal civil war. That reality came for them in October 1917. The news, delayed by weeks, finally reached Tobolsk. It was a catastrophe. Kerensky's provisional government had been overthrown. The Bolsheviks had seized power. Lenin was now the master of Russia. Everything changed almost overnight. The respectful guards were replaced, new men arrived, sent from the local Bolshevik Soviet. These were not just sullen, resentful recruits. These were hardcore, ideologically driven revolutionaries. They were men who had read the pamphlets. They truly hated the family. They saw them not as human beings, not even as fallen royals, but as enemies of the people, as bloodsuckers, as the literal physical embodiment of centuries of oppression. The atmosphere in the house turned from one of monotonous imprisonment to one of active daily menace. The new guards were brutal. They stole the family's food. They stopped the family from attending church. They would shove the young grand duchesses as they passed in the hall. They began to draw with charcoal on the walls of the stockade pornographic images of Alexandra and a single chilling drawing of a skull and crossbones with the name Nicholas Romanov written underneath. The money ran out. The food became scarce. The family was forced to live on soldiers' rations. The surreal limbo of Tobolsk was over. The true ideological and murderous hatred of the revolution had finally found them in the middle of nowhere. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were, for the first time, truly mortally afraid. In April 1918, a man from Moscow arrived in Tobolsk. He was Commissar Vasily Yakovlev, a seasoned Bolshevik with a direct mandate from the Central Committee. The Bolsheviks were in a panic. The White Armies, loyal to the Tsar, were advancing on Tobolsk. The family had to be moved immediately to a more secure Red stronghold, Ekaterinburg, in the heart of the Ural Mountains. But just as the order came, fate, which had never been kind to the Romanovs, intervened with one last cruel twist. Alexei, the Tsarevich, was sick, mortally sick. He had suffered one of his worst internal hemorrhages and was completely incapacitated, screaming in agony he could not be moved. For Alexandra, this was the ultimate, impossible choice. Her husband was being taken she knew not where. Her son was dying in the room next door. This was the moment her two life-defining, conflicting devotions, her loyalty to her husband and her all-consuming obsession with her son, collided with catastrophic force. She could not abandon her husband to these men, to an unknown fate, but she could not move her son. A frantic, tearful, and agonizing decision was made. The family would be ripped in two. Yakovlev would take Nicholas, the primary target. Alexandra, after a hysterical debate, declared she would go with her husband. "I am his wife," she said. "I must be at his side." She chose one daughter to accompany them, the robust, good-natured Maria. The other children, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and the screaming invalid Alexei, would be left behind to follow if Alexei was well enough to travel. The farewell was a scene of pure, unadulterated tragedy. Alexandra, her face a mask of stone-cold terror, was loaded into a crude peasant cart. She was leaving 4 of her children, including her dying son, in the hands of brutal guards with no idea if she would ever see them again. The journey to Ekaterinburg was a nightmare, a grueling, bone-jarring trip across the thawing, muddy landscape, harassed by local Bolsheviks who wanted to lynch the bloodsuckers on the spot. When she finally arrived in Ekaterinburg, her last faint hope of civility was extinguished. Yakovlev, who may have been trying to get them to safety, lost control. The family was seized by the Ural Soviet, a group of the most radical, violent, and independent Bolsheviks in all of Russia. They were not interested in Moscow's orders. They were interested in one thing: revenge. Alexandra, Nicholas, and Maria were marched into their final prison. It was a merchant's house on Voznesensky Prospect, a solid 2-story white house, but it was now a fortress. It was surrounded by a towering 15-foot-high double wooden stockade. Completely sealing it off from the world machine gun nests were posted on the roof. The windows were all sealed and painted over with white lime. Their world was now reduced to a few small dark rooms. This house had a name, a chilling, bureaucratic, and anonymous name that stripped away all pretense of royalty or even humanity. It was the House of Special Purpose, the Ipatiev House. The Ipatiev House was not a prison, it was a tomb. For Alexandra, this was the cocoon, shrunk to its final suffocating dimensions. The house itself was a solid, comfortable merchant's home, but its new masters, the Ural Soviet, had transformed it into a fortress of paranoia. A towering 15-foot-high double stockade was built around the property, so high that it blocked out the sky, leaving the family to pace in a small, muddy yard that felt like the bottom of a wooden well. But the true cruelty was the windows. They were not just barred, they were painted over with thick white lime, as if to blot out the world itself. The family was now forced to live in a perpetual ghostly twilight, breathing stale air, unable to see the sun or the street, their only light coming from the electric bulbs that burned day and night. This was a deliberate psychological torture, and it was overseen by a new kind of jailer. The commandant of the House of Special Purpose was Avdiyev, a hard-drinking, brutish factory worker from the local Bolshevik cell. He was the living embodiment of the new, triumphant, and vengeful proletariat. He and his guards were not professional soldiers, they were ideologues, and they saw the Romanovs as their personal spoils of war. Their primary mission was not just to guard the family, but to humiliate them, to grind the very concept of royalty into the dirt. The guards were drawn from the local Zlokazov factory, and they brought the crudeness of their world with them. They lounged in the family's drawing room, their rifles on the priceless furniture, smoking crude cigarettes until the air was blue. They would sing revolutionary songs, the International, at all hours, and would openly taunt Nicholas, calling him Nicholas the Bloody to his face. For Alexandra, this was a new circle of hell. Her icy, aristocratic contempt, which had been her armor in Tobolsk, now only incited her captors to greater cruelties. She was, to them, the ultimate target, the Nemka, the Tsaritsa, the woman who had consorted with Rasputin. They delighted in a campaign of petty psychological warfare, aimed directly at her and her daughters. The guards would follow the young Grand Duchesses, Maria, Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia, to the lavatory, a single shared bathroom at the end of the hall. The men would stand outside the door, making lewd comments, laughing, and scratching obscene drawings on the walls. They were deliberately systematically trying to break the family's spirit through sheer vulgar degradation. Alexandra's response was to retreat even further into herself. She became, in these final 70 days, a true invalid. Her sciatica, always a convenient excuse, now became her reality. She spent almost all her time in a wheelchair or lying on a chaise lounge, a living statue of tragic martyr dignity. She and Nicholas were given a corner bedroom, which they had to share with their son, Alexei. She surrounded her small space with a fortress of icons and prayer books, creating a tiny, sacred island in a sea of filth and hatred. She refused to speak to the guards, to look at them. She would communicate her needs only through her husband or her daughters, referring to her jailers only as those men. This infuriating regal silence, her last weapon, only made them hate her more. She was also consumed by a new agonizing anxiety. She was separated from her children. For 3 long, terrifying weeks, she, Nicholas, and Maria lived in this hell, with no word of the 4 children they had left behind in Tobolsk. Every sound, every rumor was a new torment. Were they alive? Were they being tortured? Was Alexei, her fragile, beloved son, even still breathing? Her faith was put to its most severe test, her nights spent in a fever of prayer, and her days in a state of numb, silent dread. Then, in late May 1918, a moment of profound, agonizing joy. A train arrived at the Ekaterinburg station, and later that day the left behinds were brought to the Apachev house. The reunion was a chaotic, tearful explosion of relief. Alexandra, seeing her children, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and her precious sick Alexei, was overwhelmed. The family was whole again. They were all together in the tomb. But the joy was poisoned. Alexei was a skeletal invalid, unable to walk, his body still racked with pain from the hemorrhage in Tobolsk. He had to be carried into the house by a sailor. Alexandra, seeing her son, was torn between the relief of a mother and the renewed crushing guilt of the carrier. This child's suffering was her fault, the physical manifestation of the curse she had brought into their lives. The reunion, which should have been a comfort, was also a reminder of her original defining failure. With the family reunited, a new, morbid, and final routine set in the 7 Romanovs, along with their 4 loyal retainers, Dr. Botkin, the valet Trupp, the cook Karitonov, and the young chambermaid Anna Demidova, were now confined to a few small rooms on the upper floor. Their world shrank to these lime-washed walls. Nicholas, to keep his sanity, would read aloud to the family for hours, working his way through the Bible, or histories, or even cheap novels the guards would sometimes provide. The girls, desperate for any distraction, would mend their own tattered clothes, endlessly restitching and patching. They would play card games like Bezique. They were forbidden to open the windows, and their only exercise was a single 1-hour walk in the muddy enclosed yard, always under the leering, watchful eyes of Avdiiv's guards. Alexandra herself rarely went out. She would sit, a dark, silent figure, in her wheelchair, watching her daughters try to maintain a facade of normalcy. She taught her son his lessons, but her true focus was spiritual. She was now, in her mind, living the lives of the early Christian martyrs. She read the book of Job, underlining passages about suffering and divine testing. She was convinced that this trial was God's plan, that their suffering was redemptive, that they were a sacrifice for the sins of Russia. She was no longer an empress. She was an abbess, presiding over a small doomed flock, preparing them all for the next world. Her detachment from reality was now complete, a perfect protective shield of fanaticism. But beneath this shield of mystical resignation, the old, pragmatic, Victorian-era Alex had one last desperate plan. It was an act not of faith, but of a mother's fierce, practical will to survive. She and her daughters had a secret. This was the true, final purpose of their lives in the Ipatiev house. They had managed, through all the searches, to smuggle in their most valuable portable possessions, the family jewels. These were not just tiaras, these were ropes of enormous pearls, massive diamond solitaires, emeralds and rubies, the portable liquid wealth of an empire. And it was here, in this suffocating, limed-over box, that Alexandra organized her final secret act of hope. This was not the act of a mystical fanatic. This was the desperate, pragmatic act of a mother, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She and her daughters, Olga and Tatiana, would sit for hours in secret, their backs to the door, a loyal attendant standing watch. With needle and thread, they painstakingly, meticulously began to break apart the magnificent imperial jewelry. They took the individual diamonds, the pearls, the rubies, and they began to sew them one by one into the linings of their clothes. They sewed them into the bodices of their dresses. They hid them inside the thick, canvas-like corsets they wore. They stitched them into the brim of their hats and the lining of their belts. It was an agonizing, dangerous, and time-consuming task. They were transforming their imperial finery into a crude, wearable, secret treasury. Why? Alexandra was a realist about this one thing. She knew that if they were rescued, or even just released, they would be penniless refugees. She had been betrayed by her English family. She would not be a beggar. This treasure, she believed, was the key to their future. It was the money that would buy them a new life somewhere, anywhere, far away from this nightmare. This secret, this shared tactile task, kept them sane. It gave them a purpose, a hope. It was, tragically, the very act that would make their final moments an obscene, prolonged horror. As June turned to July, the atmosphere outside the house grew more charged. The Civil War was closing in. The white Czech legions were advancing on Ekaterinburg. The sound of artillery fire could now be heard in the distance. The Ural Soviet, the Bolshevik captors, were in a state of panic. They could not, under any circumstances, allow Nicholas the Bloody to be rescued. The ultimate prize, the living symbol of the old world, could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The decision was made in secret, either in Moscow or in Ekaterinburg itself, that the Romanov problem would be solved permanently. In early July, the atmosphere inside the house changed, suddenly and ominously. The commandant Avdiv, the loud, brutish, and often drunk factory worker, was suddenly dismissed. He and his entire guard of clumsy, leering factory workers were replaced. A new team arrived, and a new commandant took control of the House of Special Purpose. His name was Yakov Yurovsky. He was not a drunken, chaotic ideologue. He was a professional. He was a watchmaker by trade, a man of cold, meticulous, and bureaucratic efficiency. He was a hardcore founding Bolshevik, a member of the local secret police, and he was a man who obeyed orders. The casual, drunken cruelty of the old guards was replaced by something far more terrifying: a cold, silent, and purposeful organization. Yurovsky was not interested in petty humiliation. He was interested in security. He was interested in inventory, and he was interested in a final clean liquidation. Alexandra, with her uncanny neurotic sensitivity to atmosphere, felt the change immediately. She was terrified of Yurovsky. She called him in her diary a vulgar and unpleasant man. He was the one man her icy contempt could not penetrate. He was polite, he was correct, but he was, as she sensed, a man without a soul. He immediately tightened security. He had the family's few remaining personal trinkets, their gold chains and watches, taken from them and put into a sealed box, for which he gave them a receipt. This, he explained, was for safekeeping. He was in truth already cataloging the evidence. The family's final days were lived under this new, cold, and silent dread. The sound of the artillery was closer now. They knew a battle was coming. They prayed for rescue. They prayed for the White Army. On Sunday, July 14th, Yurovsky, in a strange gesture of false civility, allowed a priest and a deacon to enter the house to perform a short liturgy. It was the last religious service of their lives. The priest, Father Storozhev, was horrified by what he saw. The family, pale, thin, and dressed in worn clothes, knelt for the service. But the atmosphere was so heavy with menace, so filled with a sense of impending doom, that when the service called for the prayer, "Rest with the saints," the priest, by his own account, began to weep, and the family joined him, their voices breaking. They were, in effect, already attending their own funeral. The end came 2 days later. The night of July 16th, 1918, was hot and airless. The family went to bed at their usual time, around 10:30 p.m. The house was quiet. Just after midnight, Yurovsky entered the offices on the ground floor. He gathered his hand-picked execution squad, a mix of Latvians, Hungarians, and Russians, from the Cheka. He distributed the weapons, revolvers, rifles. Each man was assigned a specific target. At around 1:30 a.m., Yurovsky went upstairs and woke the family's physician, Dr. Botkin. He told Botkin, with a false bureaucratic calm, that the town was in chaos. The White Army was attacking. There was street fighting, and it was no longer safe to remain on the upper floor. The entire family, he explained, must dress and move to the basement for their own safety. A tremor of fear went through the family, but it was not dread. It was the fear of a sudden, chaotic move. They did what they were told. They dressed slowly, meticulously. Alexandra, true to her character to the very end, insisted that they all dress in clean, proper clothes. They were, after all, the imperial family, not a band of refugees. The girls, with their mother, put on the special heavy corsets and bodices they had prepared. The treasury was with them. They were ready. They gathered in the hallway. Nicholas, as always, was calm. Carrying his son Alexei, who could not walk, Alexandra, the invalid, came next, demanding a wheelchair. Yurovsky snapped that there was no time. Supported by her daughters, she began the slow, painful descent. She was annoyed. She saw this not as a threat, but as an inconvenience. She was the Empress, being ordered about in the middle of the night. She walked down the narrow wooden cellar steps, her sciatica flaring, complaining to her husband about the damp and the lack of chairs. They were led across the dark, empty courtyard and into a small semi-basement room at the far end of the house. It was a barren, vaulted room, its walls stripped bare. It was empty, except for the single electric bulb burning overhead. Alexandra, in her regal, annoyed tone, immediately complained. "What is this?" she asked Yurovsky. "There are no chairs. We cannot stand. May we at least sit?" Yurovsky, his face impassive, humored her. He ordered 2 chairs to be brought in. Alexandra, the Empress, took one. Nicholas, with a sigh of relief, placed the dying Tsarevich, Alexei, on the other, the rest of the family. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and their 4 loyal servants, Botkin, Trupp, Demidova, and Karitonov, arranged themselves behind them in 2 neat rows, as if they were posing for one last, grim family portrait. They stood there in the silent, stuffy room, 11 people waiting. They were waiting for a truck. They were waiting for rescue. They were waiting for the danger to pass. Alexandra, impatient, turned to Yurovsky. "So, where are we going?" Yurovsky looked at his execution squad, who were now filing into the room, their pockets heavy with revolvers. He stepped forward, pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, and, in a loud, clear voice, began to read. The piece of paper Yurovsky held was not an order for evacuation. It was a death warrant. He stood before them, the watchmaker, the bureaucrat of murder, and began to read, his voice flat and official in the small silent room. In view of the fact that your relatives in Europe are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, he read, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to sentence you to death. The family did not understand. The words were bureaucratic, impersonal. Nicholas turned, his face a mask of pure, childlike confusion. He looked at Yurovsky, then at his wife. He stammered, "Whoa, what?" He stepped forward, as if to ask Yurovsky to repeat himself, to clarify this absurd mistake. Alexandra, for the first time, understood her aristocratic armor, her mystical denial, her icy contempt. It all vanished in a single, primal human scream. She saw the men raising their guns. She saw the truth in Yurovsky's dead eyes. "My God!" she shrieked. "My God!" She instinctively lunged forward, not to save herself, but to shield her son Alexei on the chair. She had just enough time to lift her hand to try and make the sign of the cross before Yurovsky, the professional, raised his own Colt revolver, aimed directly at her head and fired. That first shot was the signal. The small vaulted cellar, no bigger than a large living room, exploded in an unholy, deafening chaos. It was not a clean military execution. It was a panicked, disorganized, and brutal massacre. The 11 executioners, packed tightly in the doorway, unleashed a torrent of gunfire, over 70 shots in less than 2 minutes. The room filled instantly with acrid smoke, with the stench of cordite, and with the screams of the dying. Plaster dust rained down from the ceiling, which had been pulverized by stray bullets. Nicholas was one of the first to die, cut down by multiple bullets to his chest. Alexandra, shot in the head, died instantly, slumping sideways in her chair, her martyred dignity gone, her final expression one of abject terror. Dr. Botkin, the valet Trupp, the cook Karitonov, they all fell in the first volley. But when the smoke began to clear, a new surreal horror was revealed. The children were still alive. The 4 Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and the chambermaid, Anna Demidova, were staggering, stumbling, and screaming in the smoke-filled room. The executioners, now in a state of primal panic, could not understand it. Their bullets were hitting the girls, but they were not falling. They seemed for a terrifying moment to be protected by some dark magic. One of the men, Peter Ermakov, drunk and enraged, grabbed a rifle with a fixed bayonet and lunged. He tried to stab one of the girls, but the bayonet, to his horror, would not penetrate her chest. It was as if she were wearing chainmail. It was not magic. It was their mother's last fatal act of protection. It was the treasury, the diamonds and pearls that Alexandra and her daughters had meticulously sewn into their corsets. The secret hoard that was meant to buy their freedom had now become a crude, tragic, and ultimately useless bulletproof vest. It did not save them. It only prolonged their agony. What followed was not an execution. It was a butchery. The room descended into a medieval hell. The panicked, terrified, and enraged executioners, their ears ringing, waded into the smoke. They used their bayonets, their knives, and the butts of their rifles. Anna Demidova, the maid, was cornered, screaming as she was stabbed over 30 times. The girls huddling in the corner were beaten and bayoneted. Yurovsky, the only professional, stepped through the carnage, calmly firing his pistol into the heads of those who were still moving, one by one. The last to die was Alexei. The Tsarevich, who had been protected by his mother's body, was still alive on his chair, groaning, his thin shirt soaked in blood. Yurovsky, the watchmaker, stepped up to him, aimed his revolver at the boy's ear, and fired 2 shots. The Alexei problem, the secret illness that had set this entire tragedy in motion, was finally solved. The massacre, from start to finish, had taken over 20 minutes. The room was an abattoir, the floor slick with blood, the air thick with the smell of death. The hope of the Romanov dynasty, the little bird Anastasia, the diplomat Tatiana, the soul Olga, and their mother Alexandra, the woman who had loved too much and trusted too blindly, were gone. The murder in the cellar was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the cover-up and the birth of a legend. The bodies of Alexandra and her family were dragged out, wrapped in their own bed sheets and loaded onto a truck. For 2 days, Yurovsky and his men enacted a gruesome, frantic epilogue in the Koptyaki forest. They tried to burn them. They tried to bury them. They used sulfuric acid to disfigure them, all to ensure that Nicholas the Bloody and his German wife would be erased from the earth. They were, in the end, dumped into 2 separate, unmarked, and mutilated graves. 9 bodies in a shallow pit under a muddy cart track, and the remains of Alexei and Maria in a separate, burned pit nearby. The Bolsheviks then issued their great, calculated lie. They announced to the world that Nicholas the Bloody had been executed due to the threat of the White Army. But they crucially added, his wife and children had been moved to a secure location. That single lie, moved to a secure location, was perhaps Alexandra's most enduring and most tragic legacy. It created a void, a space of impossible hope. The world, which could not comprehend a slaughter so total, so nihilistic, chose to believe the lie they needed a survivor. They needed a princess to have escaped the cellar. And so for the next 70 years, the world was haunted by the ghost of Alexandra's family. A disturbed woman named Anna Anderson appeared in Berlin, claiming to be Anastasia, and launched the most famous court case of the century. The fairy tale of the lost princess was born, all because the truth, the cellar, the bayonets, the acid, and the jewel-filled corsets that failed, was simply too obscene, too pointless to be believed for Alexandra herself. Her reputation was sealed in blood and slander. For the 70 years of the Soviet Union, she was the ultimate villain. She was the textbook case of autocratic decay. She was the Nemka, the hysterical, superstitious, and possibly treasonous German fanatic who had handed an empire to a mad monk. She was the reason the glorious revolution had been necessary. She was a caricature, a historical monster. But then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the search for the truth began. Using Yurovsky's own secret report, investigators found the muddy cart track in the Koptyaki forest. They dug. They found the grave, the 9 skeletons, their skulls bearing the marks of bullets, their faces corroded by acid. And in 2007, they found the second grave, with the charred, fragmented remains of Alexei and Maria. Science, in the end, gave the final verdict. DNA testing compared against a sample from Alexandra's relative, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, proved it beyond all doubt these were the Romanovs. No one escaped. The fairy tale was dead. And with this new forensic truth, a new, complex understanding of Alexandra began to emerge. The caricature of the German witch began to fade, replaced by the far more human and far more tragic portrait of the woman she actually was. And the Russian Orthodox Church, a powerful force in the new Russia, saw her not as a political failure, but as a spiritual model. In the year 2000, in one of the most stunning reversals in modern history, the Church did the unthinkable. They canonized Alexandra Feodorovna, along with her husband and her 5 children. They were not made saints for how they ruled. They were made saints for how they died. They were declared passion bearers, Christ-like figures who had, with Christian humility and dignity, faced their suffering and their brutal, unjust death. The Nemka who had been despised as a demon was now Saint Alexandra the Passion Bearer, one of the most revered modern saints in the Russian Orthodox faith. Her icons, showing her with a serene, holy face, now hang in churches across the very nation that had once ripped her to pieces. So, what is the final story of Alexandra Feodorovna? What is the lesson we take from the life of Sunny, the girl who became a saint? She remains one of the most tragic, complex, and flawed women in history. She was not a German spy. She was not a debauched monster. She was, at her core, a Victorian Englishwoman, defined by a rigid code of duty, a passionate loyalty, and an all-consuming love for her husband. And she was a mother who would do anything to save her child. And that was the tragedy. Her love was her downfall. Her faith was her blindfold. Alexandra is a timeless, terrifying lesson in the dangers of absolutism. She is a story about what happens when you allow your own personal private world, your love, your fears, your faith, to become more real than the world itself. She was a woman who, scarred by her childhood grief, came to a country she did not understand and which did not understand her, and so she withdrew. When the ultimate tragedy struck, the curse of hemophilia that she herself had passed to her son, her withdrawal became total. She built a psychological cocoon, a gilded asylum. Inside that cocoon, there was only her family, her faith, and the one man, Rasputin, who she believed could keep the nightmare at bay. Outside that cocoon, an entire empire was burning. She could hear the screams. She could smell the smoke. But she chose to believe it was just the noise of the godless, the disloyal, the faithless. She chose to believe that the only reality that mattered was the one inside her own head. In her desperate, obsessive quest to save her son, she sacrificed her court, her family's loyalty, her government, her empire, and, in the end, her own life and the lives of the very children she was trying to protect. Her love was epic, her faith was absolute, but her judgment was, quite simply, destroyed by a fear that every parent can understand. She was not an empress who failed. She was a mother who loved too much and too blindly,